So why is it that the trend is your friend, or why do we say the trend is your friend when it comes to technical analysis? In this video, I want to share with you some insight regarding charting and looking at trends, or looking at the trend being your friend. You might have heard of this phrase, and I will say that in some cases you may actually want to put on a trade against the trend, but you have to recognize and understand what you're doing in those scenarios and situations. So first off, let's take a look at the trend overall. When we're looking at trends, and here I have a stock chart of Apple, our beloved Apple, looking at the trend and just looking at how things progress. And the way that this is done is as the trend is higher or above a certain moving average, I've just color coded green. That way it makes things easier. And once the stock is kind of under a certain moving average, we've marked it and colored it red. That way it's easier to spot those trends. Now, when we look at the trend or moving in this case, so this stock, let's say we start here in the green segment and we continue to move up, and this is kind of our trend. So it's much easier to put on a trade and go with the flow than to constantly fight against it. It's kind of like when you have water and waves and you're going with the waves and you're going with the flow. It makes things a lot easier, right? When you're pushing a car that's also moving forward, it makes things a lot easier because you're going with the flow of water or with the flow of energy. So this is where the trend is your friend, where when you're going with energy. And it does make sense to do this, especially if you're doing shorter term trading, if you're doing quicker trading, if you're doing any kind of theta decay, let's say you're selling vertical premium against it, also makes some good sense. However, there are some cases when you decide to not do things with the trend. And that could be when things are maybe sold off or you have a predefined risk. Like let's say you do a vertical spread. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about, we're doing one, let's say at the money, where you risk one to make one. And if you put one on here where the trend now is starting to go down, it is quite possible if you do one long enough duration where as long as it's just above a certain price point, you can still win and profit from it. But in this case, the difference is that when you go against the trend, you have to have enough time, or you have to have enough time in the trade, or to be able to sustain that trade long enough to be able to allow that trade to work out. Even if you're buying shares of stock, like let's say you're buying and nibbling shares of stock here, and it starts to go against you, if you can't handle the heat of it going against you in this spot or in this area, all of a sudden, that makes things difficult. And now you're going against the trend. And it's possible you can do it, but you have to be able to sustain the negativity, the momentum where it's going against you. That way, when it gets that move up, you'll be fine and you'll be okay. But you need enough time. You need enough, call it mental power and mental stamina to sustain that. So in other words, you have to block out some of those fear receptors. Okay. The same thing goes if you're playing on something short, like let's say you go in and you want to short Apple, like in this case over here, and then the stock's still going against you and it's going against you. You're fighting against the trend. You're fighting against the waves. You're fighting against the normal energy. And later on, you've given it enough time, you actually can come out profitable. It's just you need to have enough time. See, what happens is that most people, they don't give their trade enough time to work. They're right, but they're not in the trade long enough to allow it to see it profit. So they might get into the trade and it goes against them and they go against them. And right around here, they get out or exit if they're short, when in fact, just a little bit longer, they would have been just fine or profitable. And the same thing here, where they might say, hey, you know what? I'm going to get in and I want to buy the stock. And then it keeps going against them and then they get out and they're like, well, later on, now the trend reverses and starts to work. So this is why in many cases, when you are actually going with the trend and you're going here and then you follow the trend, you'll be fine because you'll feel good. You'll be winning most of the time until the trend breaks. So that's where the trend is your friend would kind of make sense. However, like I said, there are in some cases where you can fight the trend, especially when a stock is maybe a little more stretched, but you gotta have enough, again, time in the trade and be able to sustain those moves against you. If you're able to sustain the moves against you, then that's okay, because eventually things will move and get back up there. Even in here, let's say you got into a stock position somewhere, in this case, kind of where I did, and then you're fighting against it and it's still under your movement and it's still going down. The trend is still moving down. Now, if you were patient enough to wait multiple months, then in that case, you would have been just fine. But again, do you have the patience? And that's something that we have to look internally to see do some inner workings to see if that makes sense for you, if you're able to sustain that move against you and deal with it. Otherwise, this is where the trend makes sense. And in some cases, you will even get stopped out. So let's say I get into this, the trend is up, but then it's quickly stops out because the trend stops. So I would be out. Again, you attempt number 2, again, didn't work out. Attempt number 3 here actually did pan out and work fine. So if you're just trading based on the trend, in this case, it would work. So anyways, looking at the trend, this is how I would approach it, and watching these trends, like let's say we're looking at even something as simple as Zoom over here, same thing. We've got a trend, it's moving, now the trend is actually broken. So you'd say, you know what, I probably don't want to follow that trend anymore. Wait until things again go down for a little while, and then the trend starts turning, and then you can get back into the stock or position. So anyways, that's my point as far as the trend is your friend, why you go with the trend, and just some common thoughts about trend and trading with the trend. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.